Now I'm going to be discussing part 2 of security deposits in California, the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants as the tenancy is ending. So after either the landlord or the tenant notifies the other of an intent to terminate the tenancy, but before the tenant vacates the premises, a California landlord is normally obligated to provide a California tenant of the tenant's right, but not obligation, to accompany the landlord for a pre-move-out inspection. Now, this inspection is also known as the initial inspection because it predates the final inspection that the landlord or landlord's agent will make following the tenant's departure. So if you are a tenant, it's in your best interest to respond in the affirmative to a pre-move-out inspection that your landlord is normally obligated to offer you. Now, this is because the optional pre-move-out inspection affords the tenant an opportunity to address curable defects in the property that arose due to the tenant's tenancy. If the defects are not either cured or curable by the tenant, then it should be presumed that the landlord will deduct from the remaining security deposit the cost of curing these defects. Now, during the pre-move-out inspection, the tenant is entitled to go room to room with the landlord and observe everything the landlord or landlord's agent marks as damaged. Now, do you know why the inspection is especially important for the tenant? The reason it's important for the tenant is that the intention of the pre-move-out inspection is to provide notice and an opportunity to cure curable damages and deficiencies in the tenant's unit prior to the tenant vacating the unit and having the landlord deduct some or all of the tenant's security deposit to resolve the deficiencies that were not cured or curable by the tenant. Now, not all deficiencies are curable by the tenant, such as work requiring a permit or contractor's license, but for basic things like replacing a damaged kitchen item with an identical one, cleaning windows, or other basic and presumably curable deficiencies, the tenant should respond in the affirmative to the landlord's obligatory offer to the tenant of the tenant's right to request the pre-move-out inspection. So, the pre-move-out inspection form. During the pre-move-out inspection, the tenant shall offer the landlord access to the dwelling and may wish to go room to room with the landlord and observe everything the landlord or landlord's agent is marking as damaged or deficient. And for representative purposes, another sample pre-move-out inspection form is shown here. Now, your landlord should not use this exact form, rather this is an illustration to provide a breakdown that you might expect to see on your landlord's form. However, the form that I recommend and use for my clients is a 3-column form that I showed in the previous video, where the first column is filled out by the tenant upon move-in to document any pre-existing damage. The second column is for the initial pre-move-out inspection to be filled out by the landlord, and the third column is for the final post-move-out inspection to be filled out by the landlord. Now I'm going to discuss why and whether the landlord and tenant should mutually agree to have the landlord provide the itemized statement and receipts substantiating the costs incurred in restoring the premises to its pre-tenancy condition via email. So after a tenant vacates the premises, reaching that now former tenant can sometimes be difficult, as some tenants may temporarily reside in a few different addresses before settling on a new tenancy or permanent home. And as you can guess, one of the primary topics for follow-up communication after move-out tends to be the arrangement for return of security deposits and supporting documentation. Therefore, to make things easier for both sides, the landlord and tenant can mutually agree to have the landlord provide the itemized statement and receipts substantiating the costs incurred in restoring the premises to its pre-tenancy condition via email. But in order to do this properly, the landlord will need to create a written security deposit disposition agreement that contains statutory language that complies with California Civil Code section 1950.5 and mutual signatures. So a security deposit disposition agreement should not be discussed after one of the parties has tendered notice of termination. In other words, you should not include a security deposit disposition agreement in a new lease template. That would be far too early. The form you see here is a small sample of what you can expect to see, but do not use this form as is. Again, this is a sample, this is a preview. So if the tenant and landlord agree in writing, then the landlord can then email the final security deposit disposition form that provides a line item breakdown of the amounts withheld, along with copies of receipts to the tenant. and then the landlord can send the remaining security deposit via electronic payment directly to the tenant's bank account, or mail the remaining balance via check to the forwarding address the tenant had provided to the landlord. Now, the post-move-out inspection is usually the third inspection, and this is after the initial inspection, again, assuming the tenant had requested that optional inspection. Therefore, this third and final inspection will be conducted by the landlord without the landlord's presence, without the tenant's presence. So this inspection will be conducted by the landlord without the tenant's presence after the tenant has fully vacated the unit. Now, this is known interchangeably as a final inspection or post-move-out inspection. And during this inspection, the landlord or landlord's agent will go through the same rooms as during the previous initial inspection and verify that the damages discovered during the initial inspection have been rectified. If they have not, or if the damages that are new or were concealed during the initial inspection are now found, then these damages will be documented on the post-move-out inspection form. The landlord must make and provide a copy of this post-move-out inspection form, as well as all of the associated receipts for the expenses borne in restoring the premises to the same condition it was in the beginning of the tenancy that just concluded. Now, for the waiver of documentation, this is solely the tenant's decision, and a landlord is normally required to provide a form with a line item breakdown of each expense that is being deducted from the security deposit, along with receipts to the tenant within 21 days of the tenant's departure. However, the landlord can ask the tenant to voluntarily agree to waive the tenant's right to documentation at the time either party tenders notice of termination or notice of non-renewal. Now, this waiver cannot be executed earlier than 60 days prior to the expiration or termination of a lease. So in other words, again, do not include a waiver of right to receive documentation in a new lease. As always, both sides should save copies of any correspondence that one side sends to the other. This is especially important for the landlord here. Not only does the landlord need to save a copy of any executed waivers, such as this one, but the landlord should also scan and save copies of all receipts in case the waiver is later challenged, or in case the former tenant changes their mind after receiving the subsequent itemized disposition of security deposit. Now, in that case, specifically if the tenant demands proof of expense after receiving the itemized disposition and seeing how much of the security deposit was withheld, then the tenant may request, and the landlord shall provide, all requests and documentation substantiating the landlord's withholding of the security deposit, even if the tenant had previously waived their right. So for the post-move-out inspection, maybe also known as a final inspection, after the tenant has fully vacated the premises, the landlord shall conduct the third of three inspections, i.e. the final inspection. Now note, if the tenant had rejected the landlord's offer of a pre-move-out inspection, then this would be the second of two inspections. Now, during this final inspection, the landlord should go room to room and document all of the uncorrected damages and deficiencies that the tenant failed to ameliorate. So it is crucial for the landlord to be as diligent in marking all of the damages at this stage as it was for the tenant to mark all of the pre-existing damages prior to moving. And if the landlord doesn't adequately detail the damages on this form and save all the associated receipts, it could prevent the landlord from legitimately retaining the expenses of amelioration from the security deposit. Again, I prefer to use the same 3-column move-in, move-out report in which the first 2 columns were already filled in during the move-in inspection and the second during the initial inspection, leaving you with this 3rd column for the final move-out inspection, which would be filled out by the landlord. And the post-move-out inspection is often a point of contention between the parties, especially where the tenant wasn't given or wasn't offered an initial inspection, and the tenant disagrees with the extent of damage or deficiency that the landlord claims to have discovered. So therefore, it's only in the best interests of both parties to do an initial inspection, and it's also in the landlord's interest to offer one. Plus, it's also a landlord's legal requirement in California. Lastly, after the landlord completes the initial inspection and the final inspection, the landlord should give a copy of the inspection report to the tenant. Itemized disposition with security deposit. So within, but no longer than, 21 days after the tenant vacates the premises, the landlord must provide the former tenant with a statement that confirms the amount of security deposit originally received, the amount being withheld, the reasons for the withholding, and any receipts to substantiate the basis for the withholding. So if the landlord or landlord's agent did the work, then they must ensure that the work was performed properly detailed, and that the hourly rate and number of hours spent on each task are clearly legible. If the work was done by a contractor, then the receipt needs to be from the contractor's company with a letterhead identifying the company and the company contact info. The landlord must never charge the tenant more than the landlord actually paid a contractor or vendor. Now keep in mind that the total amount withheld does not exceed $125, or if the resident agreed in writing to waive the right to an itemized disposition, then the landlord is not obligated to provide an itemized disposition. As a reminder, such a waiver is only valid if given to the tenant after either party provides a notice of termination and no earlier than 60 days prior to the date of termination agreed upon. Lastly, before the landlord prepares and delivers this itemized disposition of security deposit form, it is advised that the landlord and tenant agree on a security deposit disposition agreement beforehand to ensure that the landlord and tenant are in agreement as to where the itemized disposition and remaining security deposit balance will be sent. So if the landlord is not able to have the work completed within the 21-day statutory deadline, then the landlord must provide a good faith estimate of the charges yet to be made. Then, within 14 days of the completion of the work, the landlord must provide a final itemized disposition and either a credit of the overage or an invoice for an outstanding amount still owed. And if the tenant initially waived the disposition but later requests it, the landlord must provide everything within 14 days. Forwarding address issues. So as soon as practical after one party provides notice of termination to the other, the landlord should request the tenant's forwarding address. So what is a forwarding address? Well, a forwarding address is the address that the landlord should use to send post-tenancy documentation to the tenant after the tenant vacates the premises. As you can probably guess, security deposits are one of the most important and problematic areas when it comes to accurate forwarding addresses in post-tenancies. One of the reasons for this is that a landlord is normally required by statute to send the remaining security deposit and documentation no later than 21 calendar days after the tenants move out, subject to a few exceptions. So the landlord needs to take this obligation seriously and promptly, or could face monetary penalties up to twice the amount of the tenant's security deposit. So what can the landlord do if the tenant did not provide an accurate forwarding address before departing? Well, one backup option is to request the tenant's current address from the former tenant using that tenant's email and cell phone that the landlord should still have on file. If the landlord fails to get a response, then a second backup option can be to mail everything to the address from which the former tenant recently vacated. So long as the former tenant has provided the USPS of their forwarding address, then the USPS should, but not necessarily, forward the mail to the tenant's new and current address. So what to do if ownership transfers and you have the tenant's security deposit? So what if the property owner or property manager currently holding the security deposit is replaced? Well, in that case, the outgoing owner or manager must inform the tenant that the security deposit is either A, being returned to the tenant, or B, the security deposit is being transferred to the new property owner or property manager. Make sure to include the upcoming date that the transfer will take place. Now, what if the damage exceeds the deposit? Although it's uncommon, it is possible that the amount of damage, waste, or theft committed on the property was so substantial that it exceeded the amount of the security deposit that was retained. Now, in that case, the landlord has two options. The landlord can bring suit against the former tenant, possibly in small claims court, for the unpaid balance. And B, the landlord and tenant can mutually agree to a post-tenancy payment plan in which the tenant acknowledges the unpaid balance and promises to pay back the balance in installments as consideration for avoiding litigation. Now that concludes today's presentation on security deposits in California for residential landlords and tenants. Please help me improve. What did you find helpful about this presentation? What can I do to improve? I know your time is valuable, and I appreciate the time that you spent watching this. If you found it helpful, all I ask is that you let me know, and if you'd like to leave a comment as to what topics you'd like me to discuss next as they pertain to California residential tenancy laws, please do so.